Hello and welcome to Life Unrestricted. I'm your host, Dr. Al Cobb. I'm a board-certified chiropractor and concussion rehab enthusiast in Lubbock, Texas. This podcast is devoted to helping you explore life and health in all of its many facets so that you can live a life that's truly unrestricted. All right, welcome back everybody to Life Unrestricted. Today I have a great host. We're going to learn so much about concussion rehab, concussion awareness, and really get a look behind the scenes of what a concussion is. I've got with me today Dr. Brooke Schuessler, and she's going to talk with us about her story and how we can be more aware of concussion and some of the things that are involved with it when it comes to rehab, when it comes to just symptoms and what to do. So, Brooke, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored. I always love to get to talk about brain injuries and concussions because the dialogue surrounding concussions really needs to change. And if we aren't willing to put in that work and invest in understanding and better understanding what's happening in our brain and how we can change that to help change the future of brain injuries and concussions, then what are we doing? So I'm honored you have me and to be able to talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited too. I want to give you I'll give the listeners a little bit of a bio here. So Brooke served as the state of New Hampshire's Miss New Hampshire in 2023, first chiropractor to do so. And she competed for Miss America 2024. How did that go, by the way?
It was awesome. I had the best
Nice.
experience, and it was great to be able to walk across the Miss America stage as the first ever doctor of chiropractic.
Yes, that is so cool. Were people backstage like saying chiropractic stuff like, do you want to adjust me before we go out here?
Oh, yeah, a lot more than I thought it was going to be.
Of course. And Dr. Brooke is extremely accomplished in her student career as a chiropractor student, but also throughout her career as a researcher as well. So some of her accomplishments include serving as the executive director and event coordinator of the Foundation for Vertebral Subluxation and published research author, that's one of the main chiropractic research journals and articles, and founder of Choose Health, which is an educational program for empowerment of youth to make healthy choices. She also is the founder of National Concussion Awareness Day, which that's in September.
September, yep. It's the third Friday of every September.
Third Friday of every September. You guys are going to hear a replay of this podcast on the third Friday of September this year and every year following. And she raised over $11,000 for the Brain Injury Awareness Association or Brain Injury Association of New Hampshire, served on 8 chiropractic mission trips over her lifetime to different countries. She's an advocate for brain injury awareness and is a peer lecturer on behalf of the Brain Injury Association for the past 11 years since her brain injury, which we're going to talk about here soon, that happened in 2014. Graduate of Sherman Chiropractic College in Spartanburg, South Carolina, right? It is in Spartanburg.
Yes.
The beautiful hills of Spartanburg, much different than Lubbock over here. And she had obtained her DC degree and awarded the Philosophy Award and Service to the Profession Award and Student Research of the Year Award. I told Brooke before we started, I was like, I feel like I didn't do much during my chiropractic career reading this. And co-owns her practice now, which is in New Hampshire. Is that right?
Yes, in New Hampshire.
Love it. What part of New Hampshire?
We're in Bedford, New Hampshire, so it's a little bit more southern New Hampshire.
Nice. Awesome. And she co-owns that with her chiropractic husband, Dr. John Schuessler, and they're expecting the first child this upcoming August, which everybody congratulate her on.
Thank you. We are beyond excited for another chiro
Yes.
baby.
Gosh, that's going to be amazing. Well, thank you so much again for coming on. Why don't you start off with explaining what happened and why did you get excited about concussions? Unfortunately, for a lot of people, especially in the chiropractic profession, there was some life event that jolted them into chiropractic. For me, it was concussion and a panic attack that stemmed from the concussion, I believe. But what is your story with concussions and what happened?
Yeah, so 11 years ago this March, I was in my mandatory gym class in high school. I was a freshman at Concord High School, and we were playing team handball, and a boy went to go kick a ball, and I went to go pick it up. And
Mm,
as I reached over, as he went to kick it, he ended up kicking the left side of my face, knocking me unconscious. So I laid on the gym floor for who knows how long. There was no supervision. My gym teacher and the head football coach for our hometown's football team was not in the room at the time, and so I had no um, really supervision to be able to help me get to the nurse's office and so on and so forth. So a really kind classmate helped me come to. He escorted me to the bathroom where I started to see my black eye developing,
mm,
and it was March, so I had been in that school for quite a few years, or quite a few months. I knew my way around, I knew where to go, and I got lost on my way to the nurse's office.
mm,
And that was probably the first flag to me that something was off, but I had just been kicked in the head, so I was going to give myself a little bit of grace. I went to the nurse's office, explained what had happened, and she called my mom. My mom picked me up. My mother is an incredible chiropractor. I was
mm,
born while she was in chiropractic college in Davenport, Iowa. And so she did what she knew best, and she took me, got me adjusted, and took me for a salad and a green juice. And I felt great after I got adjusted and had some nourishment in my body. And she sent me back to school. And as I sat in my English class, which I loved, I love reading and I love literature. I don't like
mm.
math. So I was in my English class and I fell asleep right there on my desk. And that was so unlike me. I loved school. I was a pretty straight A student. So I was not somebody that you would catch, falling asleep in the classroom. And so once was awoken by my teacher, I called my mom again and I left school that day not to return for 3 months.
Mm.
Out the rest of my freshman year of high school because of the symptoms and the way my life really changed after being kicked in the head. And so very quickly I started developing light sensitivity, headaches, sensitivity to noise. I would soon later on that my left eye wasn't really able to track. So reading became really challenging and very difficult. And anytime that I had to do, tracking or my eyes had to do a lot more work, my brain would get heavily fatigued. So a lot of fatigue issues, sleeping problems where I would be up all night but sleeping all day, and then memory issues. The biggest, I think, symptom that really affected my life as a teenager was the memory issues. So I had nearly daily amnesia, where I would not remember what had happened the day prior. I frequently would walk into rooms not remembering what I was supposed to be doing there, and I slowly started to lose memories of the past 2.5 years prior to my brain injury. So school dances, movies, anything that happened in my life 2.5 years prior, I have no memory of. And it took me 2.5 years after my brain injury to be able to start to create some more long-term memory. So there's about 5 years of my life that there's a gap from because of my brain injury. And I'm super thankful that I had my mom and her chiropractic wisdom to be able to guide me through that process and what this was going to look like. But I was a competitive dancer. I had never suffered a concussion previously in my life, and I just didn't really know the signs and the symptoms of even what a concussion was. My mom, being a practitioner, had really only had a few students come in with sports injuries that would have a concussion, and she knew them to get better within 2 to 3 weeks and they would be back to normal. And we just expected that I would be able to follow that as well. So there was just a severe lack of understanding overall as to what my journey was going to look like moving forward.
Yeah. And are those memories still like there's still that 5 year gap? Do you still experience that?
There's
Man.
still that 5 year gap. Obviously, 11 years after an injury and after some memory loss, I've been able to adapt and find ways to be able to cope with the memory issues that I have. I still have some shortness issues. I know that I'm not as equipped with my memory as I was previously.
Mm.
But we live in a digital age where I'm able to set a lot of reminders, live off
Mm-hmm.
of my Google Calendar, and just continue to make life work, but it's still not ideal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you hit on something that's really important there, that your mom was right about. I think the stat is about 20% of people will have symptoms after that 3 to 4 week period. Usually most people just they heal and never have any experience afterwards. And I played football, and concussions, like I had concussions all the time, or at least a mild blow to the head or neck or body that caused something like that. And it never really affected me. I was usually fine within a week or so, or several days, if I had any lingering symptoms. But there was one for sure that made me out. It kept me out for 2 to 3 weeks from playing. And then the one that I had that led to a panic attack after I was done playing. I mean, those symptoms showed up and stayed for a year and a half. So it's always an interesting conversation. Did did your experience growing up, did you plan on being a chiropractor already, or did this motivate you to think, man, I could really help somebody with this?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I grew up, within my mother's practice. When she graduated, I was 1 year old, and she opened up her practice right here in New Hampshire. And so growing up there, people would ask me all the time if I was going to be a chiropractor like my mom.
Mm-hmm.
And I quote would tell them anything but. I loved chiropractic. I loved getting adjusted. I understood that the body heals itself and that the body is a self-healing organism. And I've never been vaccinated. Like, we just have different philosophies in life
Mm-hmm.
because we just believe in the power that made the body can heal the body, and
Mm-hmm.
that the immune system is always functioning and my body's always doing what's best for me, which that outlook alone is amazing. And I'm excited to be able to offer that and for them provide that for my kids. But I never saw myself wanting to be a chiropractor and to do what my
Right.
mom did. I think I just saw it at the time as a lot of hard work, as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, as a provider, as a practitioner,
Mm-hmm.
as a chiropractor. And so I wanted an easier route out. But it wasn't until this injury and the challenges that I was met with that made me really reconsider and really reevaluate that we need more chiropractors out there, and we need more people to help hold that role in society, to be able to encourage people to understand that their body is a self-healing organism and that
Mm-hmm.
the body made the body. So I, during my time recovering from my concussion, after about 3 months post-concussion, I was still not getting any better, and my mom would probably argue I was still considering, I was still getting worse. And so she took me to the New Hampshire concussion specialist. I say that in quotes, but he was very booked out. He was the concussion specialist in the state of New Hampshire who happened to be in our town because we lived in the capital. I finally got on his books. And when I went in, he spent absolutely no time with me. He read the symptoms that I had explained that I had, looked at me for no more than 30 seconds, and prescribed me 6 medications.
Mm-hmm.
As a 14-year-old girl that had never been on a prescription medication in her entire life, one of which was a Alzheimer's medication that was still on trial. 14 years old, that's like really shaking to the core that people will walk into this concussion specialist and that is what their experience is. They're not being heard, they're not being understood, they're not being better educated on how to take care of their body and their brain post concussion. And so I think that was a huge turning point to me as to how much work there really was to be done, and that it was completely unfair the way that I was being treated, and I knew that other people were being met with that at the same time. So that really put a little bit more passion into my understanding for chiropractic and my value for the body. And once I graduated high school, I graduated early. So it was a goal that I had before my concussion that I really didn't think that I was going to be able to accomplish, having missed out on the last of my freshman year of high school. But I held on to it, and I was able to graduate at the end of my junior year and start my undergraduate degrees. And I studied neuroscience and behavior, and then knew that I was going to go on to become a chiropractor. I didn't even bother with my bachelor's degree because I knew I was going to be a chiropractor.
Mm-hmm.
I got it later.
Yeah. It all comes along the journey of chiropractic school. You're taking classes together and it's like, oh
Mhm.
yeah, you've earned a bachelor's and you've earned a doctorate along the way.
Yeah, yeah.
That's awesome. So explain a little bit about the talk a little bit about the advocacy and awareness program that you've created tying into the National Concussion Awareness Day.
Yeah, so I mentioned in the beginning that we just have so much dialogue to be able to make up for because of the misinformation and the lack of knowledge that we had years
Mm,
ago. And that just ingrained such a deep lack of understanding in getting your bell rung.
mhm.
That is still so too deep in society. And so something that I felt like I could do was changing the conversation and at least making some more awareness about that and surrounding that. So the year after my brain injury, I created a New Hampshire Concussion Awareness Day. It was a Friday in September, and I worked with the governor at the time to be able to sign that into a proclamation. But I realized, and it dawned on me, that concussions don't just happen in the state of New Hampshire; they
Yeah.
happen all across the world. So
Mhm.
I created National Concussion Awareness Day with the U.S. Patent and Trading Office to be able to create a day of awareness and hoping that big news and media outlets would pick this up and have more conversations and bring in actual good concussion specialists to be able
Yeah.
to change that dialogue and to allow conversations to happen at the dinner table from students that they learned about concussions that day. So I put it on the third Friday of every September because I never wanted it to land on a weekend. September, in my opinion, is always like back to school season and
Mhm.
football season for high
Oh yeah.
schools. I wanted it to be front and center in the curriculum and being able to go into school settings and provide my lecture and be a peer-to-peer lecturer and share my story, because sharing your story really makes students understand that it could happen to them, as well
Mhm.
as it happen in car accidents. I was not a football player. You were a football player, so you might have like known a little bit more about concussions than the average person. You at least had known the term. I thought I was immune to that, and
Right.
it would
Because you
never.
don't play football, you know?
Yeah, because I don't play football. So I was a really good example as to how you can't just dismiss this, and that it's so important to learn the signs and the symptoms in case you or a loved one or a friend were to suffer a concussion. If you're the one that's able to point it out to them, getting help and getting the support that you need earlier makes such a difference in the long term as to what your healing and what your recovery looks like. So I started National Concussion Awareness Day. I also founded Lessen the Impact. It was an educational program that I fundraised for to be able to just teach students about concussions. So I was able to speak at some universities in New York and schools all across the nation, as well as provide one school in every state a copy of the Concussion movie by Will Smith,
Oh, cool.
as well as some other films, just to be able to continue to create that awareness and create those conversations. So I have a huge passion for talking about it and sharing about my concussion, and I continue to go to Capitol Hill every March on Brain Injury Day on Capitol Hill to be able to lobby for legislation that supports brain injury survivors. A lot of times that's people who have had strokes, traumatic brain injuries, like
Mhm.
higher level injuries than I sustained, but my story is still something that's valuable and able to be shared, because not often are those stories able to be shared in the same capacity. Some people, are really clinging on to life after they've had a stroke or a traumatic brain injury. So to be able to do my part and help them in this capacity is really rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. You're hitting on probably the most important part of it is the awareness of it. And I think I think back at when my dad or my coaches were playing football, it was like you if just somebody had a concussion or they were, like you said, had their bell rung, if somebody said, "Hey man, I don't feel good," you probably got called a sissy, like got demeaned. There's so many things that can be said about the culture of sport in concussion rehab or concussion awareness. For me, I had a concussion my junior year of college. And I didn't experience the symptoms until after the game. But I started to feel woozy, nauseous, and started to just feel weird. I couldn't sleep that night. And I told my trainer the next morning at check-in. He was like, yeah, all right. He pulled me into a room and it was a really serious conversation. And it was like, okay, you have a concussion. I was like, all right, cool. What happened? Like, what does that mean? And so you say that, like, I was around it and I experienced it, but I really didn't know what that meant. And we did things to actively get us back on the field, or the impact test, which is like gold standard for return to play protocols for a while. We knew how to flunk that thing. We flunked it all the time when we took our baseline test. And so we saw it all the time that people would flunk their test, so you had a lower baseline or score to get back to. There's just, I think what you're doing is going to change the culture, and it's going to change the awareness that you, and along the lines of what people are doing to create awareness around the situation. So, and I hope this podcast can play a role in it as well. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about what you see as the common signs and symptoms after a concussion, and then what it looks like moving into what we call post-concussion syndrome?
Absolutely. I think it's super important to throw up that you might not always feel symptoms right away. I
Mm-hmm.
really didn't. I had that black eye developing, and that's why I felt better when I got adjusted. I had a salad and I went back to school
Mm-hmm.
to be able to pass out in class and then be met with all of the symptoms later. So it can take up to 2 to 3 days for symptoms to really start to come on. And so that's why it's really important that you can be able to kind of think back as to the things that you've gone through. If you were in a car accident, that you're watching yourself for the next 3 to 4 days and making sure that you're not developing any new symptoms, because that can be a huge factor. Whiplash, any injury to your body can also cause a brain injury and can cause
Mm-hmm.
that changing of the neurology in our brain.
Mm-hmm.
I love to give the analogy in my high school and middle school presentations, even college presentations, of putting an apple in a jar and then filling that jar with water. And if you shake that jar, the apple crashes into the sides of the jar. And that is like your brain in cerebral
Mm-hmm.
spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid is amazing. We love it. It bathes our nervous system, it bathes our brain, it clears
Mm-hmm.
out all the junky things that we don't want building up, and gets out all of that debris. But if you put, bubble wrap or a helmet around that jar, it does not change the impact that's happening.
Right.
And so when you think about a car accident or even a really big body hit in wrestling or football or soccer, things like that, that still shakes that apple in that jar and can leave you with a concussion. So it's super important to understand that baseline,
Mm-hmm.
because so much of the misinformation in that dialogue really surrounds with the, you've got to be hit in the head, you've got to be knocked unconscious, and seeing
Mm-hmm.
stars beyond
Mm-hmm.
that to be able to really be taken seriously. So most commonly, the symptoms that I'm seeing are sensitivity to light or noise. I had both. Problems tracking, headaches are very common. If you've thrown up even a few days later, that is less common, but it's there. Problems sleeping. If you are noticing that when you're going from laying down to sitting up or sitting up to standing, you're getting really dizzy, not just like a little lightheaded, but
Mm-hmm.
dizzy. Dizziness is another sign of a concussion, and things of that nature. And what it kind of goes into with post concussion is the same symptoms. It
Mm-hmm.
can just linger and last a lot longer. For me, it was the memory issues, the eye tracking, the headaches. My sleep improved dramatically after the first 3 weeks, but I was still fatigued and very tired. So it's really important to understand that every concussion is so unique. What area of your brain
Mm-hmm.
was damaged, it changes how you're relating to life. So you might have a lot more balance issues than headaches, or eye issues than the balance issues, or things like that. It's so unique, and it really only takes one or two symptoms or feeling off to be diagnosed with a concussion. It's
Mm-hmm.
super important that we take that seriously. While we're on the topic of all the football and repetitive concussions and things, it's also super important to realize what the effects are of repetitive concussions.
Oh, yeah.
So if you think you've been in a situation where you've had one concussion, wrap yourself in bubble wrap, because you are 2 times more likely to suffer a second concussion during that phase of recovery. And if you were to suffer a second concussion, you are 4 times more likely to suffer a third, and
Mm-hmm.
just astronomically going up and up, because our perception is off. We might be already dizzy, easier to slip and fall. If you're
Mm-hmm.
putting yourself back on a sports field,
Mm-hmm.
your reaction time is slowed down, things like that. So if you have had more than one concussion, you really need to evaluate what you're doing and how you're taking care of yourself. Because when we have multiple head injuries and multiple concussions, it creates these tau proteins that start to build up over time. That's what we know as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or
Mm-hmm.
CTE. It's what a lot of, unfortunately, football players who have taken their life, taken the life of others, or have passed due to, like, from early, just passed at a young age. We see this buildup of this tau protein in their brains, and that is from this repetitive axon stretching in our brain. So you don't have to be a professional sports player to have this happen to you. I think that's something that I continue to just talk about and harp up on, because
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't think that I would ever be affected by this. But I'm excited. I donated and pledged my brain post-mortem to the Boston Brain Bank that does all of the research with chronic traumatic encephalopathy after my life is over. So
Wow.
we'll be able to continue to see as we gather more research and data on what it looks like to have had a brain injury.
Yes, absolutely. You admit those things, that's awesome. What I tell people, the analogy of the apple is awesome, because you're right. Your brain is sitting and suspended in this fluid that, regardless of the amount of protective padding around it, it's gonna slush around. It's gonna move. I'm an
It
upper
protects
cervical
that
chiropractor.
skull, which is awesome. Protects your skull, but
Yeah, absolutely.
there's more valuable things inside.
Yes. So I'm an upper cervical chiropractor, and the majority of my practice and rehab for cervical spine complaints relating to concussions, they do happen at very low force. There have been some that's like, wow, you had a really traumatic event. A lot of it, though, is a car accident. It's gone 10, 15 miles per hour, 5 maybe. Oh, I just had a rear bender. See, I'm still dealing with my concussion symptoms. A fender bender. And maybe that was impactful. I never really thought about it like that. And so when it comes to understanding just the mechanisms that we can have a concussion at, it's important to realize that, like you said, the brain is suspended in this fluid, but it's not just unanchored there. If you bend over, the brain and spinal cord kind of stay in the same exact spots, because they're anchored to the brain, they're anchored to the base of the skull, they're anchored to the first several bones of the neck, and then sequentially, occasionally throughout different parts of the spine. And that's so that your spinal cord, when you bend over, it doesn't sink up into your brain. And it's a good thing, right? And that's another point that research is starting to point towards. It's what you talked about, the axonal shearing or torsion. Those very, very small cells in the brain, called neurons, they have shafts on them called axons. When they're torn through these mechanisms, so say you had that brain injury, and it's like if you had a bowl of Jello and you slapped it, and the Jello just jiggles. It's exactly what we see. So for people listening, that's a great analogy. And all the brain and nervous system tissues are anchored in there. So the points where they're anchored are going to have some tension, and they're potentially a point of very minute shearing or tearing, and that causes this inflammatory cascade in the brain. And one thing that that you probably see is people that have psychological issues after a concussion. And for me, my story was I took a header from a D1 soccer player, and I played football. I played soccer occasionally, but man, I took a header and I was down for a second. About a week later, I had a panic attack. And what I started to realize now, going back through the education of concussion rehab and concussion mechanisms and why some of these things pop up, I started to realize that within 2 to 4 hours of a brain injury like that, the entire gut microbiome loosens up and you have an intentional gut or leaky gut intestinal hyperpermeability, so that your body, like you mentioned earlier, it's so intelligent. It's like, we got to get these toxins out. We got to find a way to process through these better. So it's trying to get blood everywhere. It changes the way that blood goes into and out of the skull. It changes the way that the fluid in the skull goes into and out of the base of the skull and into the spine. And that inflammatory process is so important for the body to heal. But if we don't move on from that inflammatory process, it turns into what we call post-concussion syndrome. And that's where you're having symptoms of the dizziness, the psychological issues, the mood changes, the vertigo, postural changes continually throughout that process, years, months, years, decades later, even I've seen. And I honestly think people get gaslit whenever they say they've had some type of issue with concussions and then psychological issues, because it's all in your head. You don't have any symptoms. I sat through a counselor, and the counselor was great. He sent me to a psychologist, and the psychologist said, well, there's not really anything wrong. We don't see anything clinically wrong. And I'm like, I don't think you understand. I'm watching my world in third person. Something is wrong. My memories, they're not mine. My birthday, that's not my birthday. Social security number, if I could remember it, I would tell you. Me going to the parking garage and looking for my car for 40 minutes, that's not normal, you know? So there's something going on here. And it wasn't until I sat down with the chiropractor that he put all this together, which
Yeah.
is an interesting concept. But I digress from my monologue. And it's important
Well,
to,
it's so true. You're like 3 times more likely to suffer from depression after
Mhm.
a concussion, and whether that you recovered in a week or two, or you're having post-concussion syndrome. And there's such a lack of understanding. One, you're blown off and brushed off by how many people, whether it's an old guy that just has outdated views on concussions, or even some young people our age, like still have this lack of understanding and don't have any empathy when it comes to this invisible injury. Um, but there's also that huge shift in how you're experiencing life. Now, I was a competitive dancer. I was not able to go back to dance. I was not able to do any of the things that a normal freshman in high school would be able to do. Wasn't able to
Mhm.
have a social life in any capacity. My mom stripped my phone and any like media sources away from me because she wanted my eyes to be able to recover as best as possible, and it's not good
Mhm.
to screen time. So I felt absolutely stripped of everything. I went through a bout of depression after my concussion as well, and that was another amazing medication that the concussion specialist wanted to slap on me, which wouldn't have helped my brain continue
Mhm.
to recover. It's definitely a rabbit hole we can go down.
Yes, that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask, what are your for people who are listening to this and they're like, man, you are checking off all of my boxes. I've experienced all of these things. What are some first steps for people who have had a concussion and maybe they just had it, or maybe they're in the throes of it months down the road and they don't really know what to do or how to seek out answers or solutions? What would your advice be for some first steps?
First steps, I will always recommend starting a journal, a healing journal of some
Mm,
capacity, writing down what your experiences are of that day and the date. And if you feel like it, or if you are having severe migraines, like rank your severity. One thing that happens that I see over and over and over again with the healing concussion community is that we don't understand how far we've come. because of the memory issues or because of just like the lack of understanding and clarity of your path so far, it gives you something to be able to look back on, as well as something that you can bring to professionals. If you're going into different offices, you have a tracked journal of what your experiences have been like. For me, I could not remember anything. And so if I didn't have my mom being the advocate for me, I don't know what that journey would have looked like for me. And if you are an adult that is a provider yourself, you have to figure out how you're also going to be able to provide for yourself in this capacity. So I highly recommend starting a journal, logging the things that you're experiencing. If you're having random food aversions, throwing up, all the symptoms, everything that you're experiencing, if you couldn't
Mm-hmm.
sleep at night, all the things that you can, try to log it, because in a few months, when you're no longer in that space, you will be able to look back and it will be rewarding to know that you have healed in some capacity and that you are getting better and that you're on the right track. Because if you have nowhere to look back to, you don't understand what more healing can happen, and you feel very stuck.
Mm.
Beyond that, get your spine checked. You can't have a head injury without having a neck injury, and
Mm-hmm.
spine to be dealing with that in other capacities.
Yeah. Can I put some numbers to that? So
Yeah.
it takes, like you probably know, about 70 to 120 G's of force to cause some type of concussion. And that can happen to the head, the neck, or anywhere in the body that jolts the spine or nervous system around in a certain way. It takes 4 to 6 somewhere G's of force to cause an injury in the spine, or particularly for my context, the upper cervical spine. That's 25 or so times the amount of force created to cause a concussion than to cause a problem in the neck. So you're right. If you have a concussion, you have a spine issue as well. And that is the PTs that I talk to, the speech therapists, the optometrists that I talk to that deal with some eye movement disorders, they underestimate the impact, and the research shows it too, the impact that cervical spine treatment can have on concussion care. So, sorry, I digress.
Yeah, no, you're so right. I'm glad that you have the numbers for that, because most commonly it is our upper cervical region that is subluxated after a brain injury. For me, I'm super thankful that my mom was able to get me adjusted right away.
Mm-hmm.
Even just coming from the perspective of understanding how valuable your cerebral spinal fluid is. If we have misalignments in that upper cervical part of our cerebral spinal fluid has an amazing pump mechanism that cleans our
Mm.
brain, bathes our spinal cord, and pretty much our nervous system, to be able to clean out debris. And after you've had an injury, there's going to be that stretching of those axons. There's going to be debris, in our between our blood-brain barrier, and we want our cerebral spinal fluid to be able to clean that out. And so if you have a misalignment at the very top of your spine, that's going to occlude that process and that pumping mechanism, which is why you might hear so many people, so many NFL players who finally get adjusted for the first time in their life, they will
Mm-hmm.
have this feeling of like the toilets getting flushed.
Oh, yeah.
And is their cerebral spinal fluid. So if you don't need, again, you don't need to be an NFL player to be able to go get adjusted. It's super important to make sure that your nervous system is functioning as properly as it can so that your brain can heal from this injury. And then my next go-to that's really easy is to watch what you're eating. Really stop with the inflammatory sugars, starches, processed foods, high omega-3 diet, so a lot of avocado, a lot of salmon, and a lot of antioxidants. So I had like a blueberry Greek yogurt smoothie almost every single day recovering
Mm-hmm.
from my brain injury. I had a ton of salmon, ton of avocado, flaxseed, things like that will help your body continue to recover. If I like to kind of think of our body as being kind of kicked down, almost like you're fighting off an infection or a stomach bug after a brain injury, but it is way more severe. And so if we're handing our body harder things to process and harder things to do, it's just not going to be able to do it, and you're not going to get better.
Hmm.
So giving your body a lot of good nutrients and a lot of good love does wonders for
Hmm.
healing and for recovery. And then I also recommend probably trying to find a naturopathic doctor that can understand this process and what we're talking about with nervous system health, so that you're not met with a concussion specialist like I was, that just wants to slap band-aid fixes on really severe issues. If I was 69 years old and I had a concussion and I was having a lot of memory issues, I might take that Alzheimer's medication. I know I personally wouldn't,
Hmm.
but there's no way that we should be prescribing that a 14-year-old girl an Alzheimer's medication that's still on trial. So
Hmm.
being able to find somebody that's able to be an advocate for you and listen to your story and help you create a game plan is very rewarding.
Yeah, to have somebody along with you in the journey is it's it's invaluable to have
Mm-hmm.
somebody that you can listen to. For you, it was your mom and some other people in your life, but a lot of people, I mean, it can just be as simple as reaching out to a practitioner saying, "Hey, can you help me? Can you help me walk through this? Can you help me understand these symptoms, why I'm feeling this way?" I think that's the most comforting thing, because the invisible injury that you mentioned earlier, it's debilitating sometimes. And just to not be able to put your finger on it and say, I want this to heal. Can you heal this? You can't sew it up. You can't you can't ice it. You can't put a Band-Aid on it physically. So it's harder to conceptualize healing through some of these things. Another thing I would add, first steps, is literally first steps. After after a day or two from your concussion, you want to start moving your body below a symptom threshold as is comfortable, I guess. So walking until you feel symptomatic, and then seeing how long that took, and then going back as well the next day. Can I walk a little bit further? Because the brain thrives, and the CSF pumping mechanism thrives on the movement of the body so that you can heal, and the brain needs that information. I think one of the frustrating points that I hear all the time from practitioners who are telling kids, hey, just sit in a dark room until all your symptoms go away. What if they never go away? What if they're just barely gone? I think it does more damage than good after, and the research will back this up, after 24 to 48 hours. You got to start moving around, and you got to get into community again. We can get into a dark place when we're sitting in a dark place alone, and getting into a community, walking, getting out in the sun, all these things are going to enhance your recovery along that path. Even if you don't have symptoms after 2 to 3 weeks, within a day or so, especially at home, it's free. You just eat well, eat a little bit less than you normally would, and take some time to walk and be in community and get into the world again. That's going to help you tremendously.
Absolutely.
But yeah, we'll close with this. What are some words of hope you have? Because you've had your own journey, you've advocated for people that are having their own journey, and now you get to treat people who are going through this and be that person that is their personal advocate and support throughout their care journey. What words of hope do you have for those healing for concussions?
It's a little cliche, but so much healing comes with time.
Mm-hmm.
I did not understand that at my 14-year-old self.
Mm-hmm.
We live in a world where we have instant gratification, and so that's oftentimes why so many people dismiss an injury that they may have had 2 or 3 days ago that they're now experiencing symptoms from, or a car accident that
Mm-hmm.
a minor car accident that happened a few days ago, is because we think everything has to have a cause and effect currently, very quickly. And so when I would go to these brain injury events and I would talk to brain injury survivors who, from looking at them, had it so much worse off than I I did, and they would hold my hand and tell me to not give up, and that so much healing just happens with time. I now, as a doctor of chiropractic, we understand how the body works to a better degree than I did when I was that age. And so I do understand now that our body just needs time to be able to recover and to regenerate these nerves and create new neural connections that have been lost. When your body is going through such a high stress recovery situation, it's going to take some time. And so many people, time after time after time again, told me that they saw the biggest chunk of healing a year after their concussion and then 5 years after. And so I held on to that. I did see a huge change in about a year mark. If you are somebody that's suffering with the post-concussion syndrome, then know that time is a huge factor, and to not give up that hope and not give up on yourself and continue to advocate for yourself. But I did really, it was true. I saw the most amount of healing at a year, plateaued for quite a while, had to try some new things, and then I saw so much healing happen around the 5-year mark. So really understanding that our body is super powerful and is always doing what's best for you, and that is adapting. Whatever that looks like for you, just give yourself a lot of grace and know that your body is continuing to be the biggest advocate for yourself. Don't give up on it.
Absolutely. Never give up. There's always going to be something on the other side, and I tell people as well, and those are such wise words from somebody who's lived through it, that the time is on your side as long as you're being active, and you don't want to ever find yourself in a situation where you become complacent with where you are, because there's always something out there, and your body is intelligent enough to continually heal and adapt regardless of the situation that you're in. So if you give it valuable information, you give it good resources, you give it good food and nutrients and stimulation, then you will heal. If you do it in community with people that care about you and love you, you're going to get better eventually. And like you said, it's just a matter of time. And us being chiropractors, we've got to mention the chiropractic principle number 6, the principle of time. There's no process that does not require time. And it's invaluable to have that as part of your strategy. And also at the same time, as you strive to heal and not be complacent, have some grace with where you are in the moment. I think it's easy to say it's never going to heal, it's never going to get better, and I hate where I am right now. And if we don't get over the aspect that we are experiencing these things, and we can accept where we are at the moment, understand our limitations or our restrictions at the moment, and also be excited to strive towards those in small incremental steps over time, that's going to make a massive difference in our mindset. And we know that our mindset plays a massive role in our healing. So thank you so much for those words. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that concludes, gosh, we could talk for hours about this, and you guys will hear over the next several weeks more interviews with people who are in the concussion rehab space. And Dr. Brooke Schuessler has just kicked us off tremendously. If you'd like to get in touch with Dr. Brooke, you can find her on Instagram at Dr. Brooke Mills. You can find her on Facebook with the Facebook Advocacy group, the National Concussion Awareness Day, and at BIA_USA. You can find her business, Crossroads Chiropractic on Instagram, and I would assume Facebook as well.
Absolutely.
Any last thoughts, Brooke?
I'm always here to be a resource, whether it's near or far. I love being able to talk and to hear stories and to help inspire you to not give up hope as well. So again, always here and happy to have any conversations with any of you out there if you're in need.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You'll find all that information in the show notes. Dr. Brooke, thank you so much for coming on. This has been an invaluable conversation for people, not only myself, but people who are going through this or may go through it in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.